Hello, everyone. I'm Punar Givanj, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we're very excited to have Tensie Whelan. Tensie is Distinguished Professor of Practice for Business and Society and the founding director of the NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business, where she is bringing her 25 years of experience working on local, national, and international environmental and sustainability issues to engage businesses in proactive and innovative mainstreaming of sustainability. As president of the Rainforest Alliance, she built the organization from a 4.5 million to 50 million budget, transforming the engagement of business with sustainability. Her previous work included serving as executive director of the New York League of Conservation Voters, vice president of the National Audubon Society, managing editor of Ambio, a journal of the Swedish Academy of Sciences, and a journalist in Latin America. Tensie has served on numerous nonprofit boards and currently serves on the advisory boards of Allo Advisors, Giant Ventures, and Nespresso. Tensie holds a BA from New York University and MA from American University and is a graduate of the Harvard Business School Owner-President Management Program. She was awarded the Stern Faculty Excellence Award in 2020 and made Distinguished Professor of Practice in 2023 in recognition of her contributions to Stern. Enjoy. Hello. Welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Tensie Whelan. Tensie is a distinguished professor of practice at NYU Stern, and she's the founding director of NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business. Tensie, welcome.
Thank you. So great to be with you.
So please tell us more about your background and how you came to the roles you're at today.
Well, let's see. I grew up in New York City, and but also my family had a place in Vermont, so I was lucky enough to sort of have those contrasts of urban and rural, but also got very interested in nature and being out of doors. And then when I was a kid, my grandparents lived in Mexico City, so we spent time there, and I got very interested in other cultures, and so I think those were some of the. And both of my parents worked in the nonprofit world. And in terms of my career, after graduate school, I went and worked overseas, first in Sweden, where I edited an international environmental journal for the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And then I went to Central America, based in Costa Rica, but working throughout the region on covering sustainable development stories. And from there, I came back to the States. I worked at the National Audubon Society in charge of their communications department, and then I went from there to running and building the New York League of Conservation Voters, and then the Federation of State Conservation Voters around the country, which I started from scratch. Both of those things really, and then from there went to Rainforest Alliance. And Rainforest Alliance, I came in when it was a $4 million organization with some great ideas, but hadn't really scaled. And so I took it to scale. When I left 15 years later, it was a $50 million organization working in 60 countries around the world. With our focus was on helping to improve sustainable livelihoods and conserve biodiversity through using market mechanisms, through engaging with business to ensure that they had sustainable supply chains, that they were supporting the producers in both environmental and social improvements and practice. And then from there came to Stern to set up the NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business. And our mission at the center is to help current and future business leaders really embed sustainability core to business strategy to drive better societal performance and better financial performance, because we see those two as really intertwined. And in fact, that's what I saw when I was in the field for Rainforest Alliance. And one of the reasons why I came to Stern is I got very interested in that connection.
I love your background of like multi-country, multicultural, all of the above like places because it's so relevant and important when you want to talk about anything sustainable, right? Like any practice. So amazing. And okay, we can get straight to it, right? So in that work at Center for Sustainable Business, what have you seen? Maybe let's talk about like overarching themes and challenges that you're seeing in that work.
Yeah, so at the center we work in a couple of different ways, right? So we have
Mm,
educational programs for undergraduate, graduate executives on sustainable business and finance. We also have research work that we're doing. I'll talk more about that. And then we have sort of thought leadership where we write
mm,
for HBR or we hold conferences for practitioners, that type of thing. When I came to Stern, we had none of that. There was no programs for students, there was no research, there was no thought
wow.
leadership on sustainability. And what we've done since then is really focus on developing curricula, experiential learning activities, research, et cetera, that aims to provide both current and future business leaders with those skills and insights that will help them manage their companies in a way that's more sustainable. And our
Mm,
unlock is that sustainability is actually just good management, right? It's just incorporating an understanding and management of material, environmental, social, and governance issues that really can affect your business strategy. So,
mm,
if, for example, you're a property and casualty insurance company insuring facilities in Texas and Florida, you actually need to understand the climate risk, manage for it, or you're going to be out of business, right?
yeah,
That's on the downside, but there's a lot of opportunity in the upside in terms of how sustainability can drive innovation, operational efficiency, employee retention, supplier resiliency. I mean, a whole series of different
yeah.
benefits. So that's where we're really focused is on unlocking understanding through both education and research around
Mm,
those value drivers of better management and financial performance through sustainability, right? In
mm.
on what's material for a given company or industry.
Okay. So what have you seen in kind of the awareness of those benefits landscape?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I came to Stern to do this is that at Rainforest Alliance, I could talk to
Mm,
CEOs, CMOs, I could talk to most everybody in the C-suite about mm, how to market sustainability or how to improve the livelihoods of people on the ground or what constituted credible, biodiversity conservation. But when I tried to talk to them about the business case and the financials, they're like, you're an environmentalist. What do you know about this? So,
yeah.
but yet I saw like, as an example, I saw cocoa farmers with, in Africa whose income is incredibly low normally, see their
Mm,
productivity go up, their input costs go down, their weather resiliency improve, their access to markets improve. I saw the brokers who are purchasing products see theft go down, which meant their insurance premiums were lower. They also
mm,
had lower risk from their suppliers and obviously market share benefits with their buyers. And we saw the buyers, the brands, grow market share, be able to charge premiums, reduce the supply
mm.
chain risk, et cetera. Nobody was tracking all those things. So that to me is like
Wow.
very consistent when you look. And now that I've come to Stern, I've been working on this for 10 years and really developed a whole methodology about it, worked with a lot of different industries beyond the ones I worked at Rainforest Alliance, developed a whole series of tools and ways to tackle it. Over and over and over again, I find companies, even those with strong, robust sustainability programs, are not
Mm,
tracking the return on their sustainability investment. They do that in every other area of human endeavor, not in sustainability. And we can talk about why I think that's the case. But that's a huge problem. And it's also, I believe, one of the reasons why we have this backlash in the United States and elsewhere, because um, people who, for other reasons, really, who don't like sustainability are
mm.
using the fiduciary duty and sort of financial argument, even though they really don't like it for political reasons, right? And
Yeah,
so because companies haven't been tracking that, they're on their back foot. They can't really fight back. So that
yeah,
to me is a huge problem that I've seen. I've got lots of others I can talk about, but that's
yeah, yeah,
that's a really
yeah.
big one. Yeah.
And that's a really, really good one. And going back to the reasons on why, like what, so what were some of the whys, or is that more, is there a universal why?
I mm, there's a set, and I think it varies in intensity by types of companies or
Okay.
regions.
Yeah.
I think first and foremost, companies often start sustainability programs for reasons where they don't then set up the way to track the returns. So one reason might
Oh,
be there's regulation, so I just got to do it.
right.
Or there's an activist campaign that sort of really tarnished my reputation, and so I need to fix that. Or there's
Mm.
a set of investors or set of consumers who are asking for sustainable products or services. So I'm going to move to address that need. But they're not recognizing that, let's say they put in place a regulatory compliance program. For example, I looked at this with
Mm.
automotive, where in the EU, automotive companies are required to be responsible for end of life disposal of their vehicles.
Hmm.
So one company that we looked at was reusing 2.5% of old car components, putting it into new cars, and selling 10% to recyclers and paying to dispose of the rest.
Mm.
They were netting $100 million on that. They did not know that
Wow.
because they were looking at it as a compliance issue and were not tracking, right, those returns.
Wow.
And I find this over and over again, small amounts, big amounts, doesn't matter.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's the one problem is that. Another problem is that investors and regulators are asking for ESG reporting and financial reporting, but not how the two interact.
Oh,
So there's no demand for that information.
yeah.
Thirdly, the CFO is often sort of the last to the table in terms of interest in sustainability. They tend to see it as a cost center and want to minimize it.
Yeah.
They certainly don't see the benefit of messing with their accounting systems, which are complicated, legacy, probably they have many in different countries.
Mm.
And to sort of begin to track some of the stuff, you actually have to change things somewhat to be able to
I
track
see.
it. So if they don't understand that there's a significant financial value here, why would they do that?
Mm.
So those are a few of and I would say the final reason is that sustainability strategies are often designed in one place, but the impacts of them financially show up in a lot of different places. So you might have a procurement strategy on sustainability that might actually result in employee retention benefits
Yeah.
or in branding benefits, but it's being viewed as solely a procurement issue, and we aren't collecting data on
Mm.
what the benefits are elsewhere in the company, if even, and we may not even
Mm.
be collecting them in procurement. But those are some of the reasons.
And it's so like interesting in the sense that like it doesn't get integrated into the business as a whole,
Exactly.
right? So it remains in its like silos,
Silo.
which then
Mhm.
also like limits the like how much budget you really can have allocated
Exactly.
to it, right? If there's like no, if it's not part of the business.
Yep.
Um, the example that you were giving on like cocoa farms too was really interesting, but also made sense in the way that I feel like in some, developing countries or in contexts where there's really just lack of resources, right? Like either like frugal innovation is necessary or you have to like be really just smart with your resources because you don't have many.
Hmm.
We see lot of like circular approaches emerging or more like sustainable practices emerging just because there isn't the luxury to be
Hmm.
wasteful.
Hmm.
And as we grow into like bigger corporations, and I think this is what the ROI, like tracking the value is to that point, right? There's actually, and then how this actually financial, there's so much wastefulness
Yep.
in how we're going about things. And I guess like there needs to be a reframe for like finance to be like, well, this is actually like cost management, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so, yeah, exactly. So if we think about pollution or waste, right? It's the ultimate in an operational inefficiency because you're buying more
Mm.
than you need to
Yeah.
pay to dispose of what's left over. That
Yes.
is the definition of an operational inefficiency. But again, people see it as compliance. The other issue is that companies, and this is not just with sustainability, this is true overall, companies generally do not track avoided cost in their financials.
Mm.
And so in their accounting systems. So if you aren't tracking financial cost, avoidance, financial cost avoidance.
Avoidance.
Obviously,
Yeah.
they're tracking cost, but they're not tracking cost avoidance, right? Um, you don't know that your decarbonization strategy is resulting in X% less energy cost. You don't know that your water conservation techniques are resulting in X less water costs. You don't know that your
Mm,
circular program is resulting in less waste disposal costs because you're not set up to track that. And often those
yeah,
numbers are
wow.
quite sizable. I'll give you another example. A pulp and paper company that operates in the southeast of the United States, they don't pay very much for water there. It's not a water risky area,
Hmm.
but pulp and paper uses an enormous amount of water. So the sustainability leads say, hey, we need to look at the water. The mill managers were like, why? Because we don't pay much for it, and it's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
not a risk issue. Um, and he persisted and he looked at it and he found that the amount of energy required to move around and heat and cool all that water, plus the disposal costs of that water, was costing each mill $1.5 million per year
Oh
per
my
mill
God.
for that quote unquote free water. Right. So it's just like people have not the kind of mentality. We've grown up in a world where both natural resources are cheap and easy and waste disposal is cheap and easy, and we that's no longer the world we live in anymore, in fact, because we've
Yeah,
messed it
yeah,
up so
yeah.
much with that attitude. Right, so yeah, that's
Exactly. It's almost like this is like a survival strategy at this point, It's not a luxury. We like this
what I think.
mindset shift. Yeah. And do you also find like in some of like this often comes up with like companies like, oh, like we tried something and then and already like what you said in terms of like the accounting systems and there's so much like benchmarking in that space is like, oh, but they're not doing it, so we're not going to do it. Oh, but they started to do it, we started to do it. And if you don't see these good practices or examples, then that benchmark, the healthy benchmarking also doesn't
Mhm.
happen. But with that too, there's already like so few, like actually there are many, but to your point, like because it's not tracked, when there's like some initiatives happening within the company, and if it's not successful, quote unquote, it's like oh my God, we tried that, that does not work, right? Like
Right.
there's a and that normally like there is a prototyping culture and like a first iteration
Sure.
culture in like other spaces, but in many spaces we, especially when it touches upon like sustainability, accessibility, whatever, like
Mhm.
newish space that is like relevant to actually like better business. There is like if you have this failed example, then it's like, oh, like we tried that and it doesn't work. And there are so many of these stories. Like we launched this, like let's say we launched a 100% recyclable version of this thing that was not recyclable before, and consumers hated it. And so we stopped, we discontinued. Like I've heard that so many times. And I was wondering, like, is this because, well, now I'm looking back to the silos that you're mentioning a little bit. But also I'm like, well, it's getting conflated. Like what was the actual failure there,
Right.
which resulted in consumers not even understanding
Right.
what this was about. So like I'm wondering like how storytelling communication also falls into this kind of like non-tracking
Yeah,
habit.
well, so to that point that you raised, I think there's a number of interesting factors. I see that, often too. Right. So if I remember, for example, working with a company when I was running Rainforest Alliance, I said, all right, we're gonna experiment with they had a conventional coffee company. We'll try a
Mm,
sustainable line. They put it out there. The packaging was ugly. They charged like 100% more, or maybe it was not 100%, 50% more for it. Um, it was set up to fail.
exactly. Oh yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if they intended to set it up to fail, but like you could tell you could just tell it was going to fail. So there's a challenge about companies going in and sort of putting massive premiums on products. One,
Right.
two, in the early days of all this work, sustainable products often weren't you need if you're putting out a sustainable product, it has to meet the core attributes that the customer is looking for. Nobody's
Yeah,
going to buy a sustainable chocolate bar more than once that tastes bad. Nobody's going to buy a sustainable laundry detergent more than
exactly.
once that doesn't work, right? And so we had a bunch of those. And so that also has created a hangover. But the problem was that they just weren't creating the good products, right? The other thing that we see happen, this goes back to the core attribute stuff. We worked with Edelman to look at kind of what messagings on the environmental sustainability side
Mm,
work best with what types of consumers. We found that the right messages worked across all categories of consumers, red state, blue state, young, old, rich, poor, educated, uneducated, did not matter.
Mm.
But generally, in most cases, you need to start with the right core attribute message, and then you can add on up to two additional of the right kind of sustainability messages, and you can drive purchase intent from 34% to 77%. And in fact, our
Wow.
we also have we work with Circana, which collects all of our barcode data at retail
Mm-hmm.
for every single consumer packaged good product sold in this country. And we've been tracking that data for 10 years, and sustainably marketed products are growing 28% faster than conventional sorry, they're growing nearly twice as fast as conventional at a 28% premium. And so the reality is consumers are buying this and they do care about the right messaging, but it's got to work. It's got to
Yeah.
taste good if it's a food product. And
Yeah.
you can't message. So this is the other problem that I think companies have, and I'll talk about B2B as well. But on the B2C side, there was a great example that Freya Williams wrote in Green Giants, this book she wrote, where she talked about two uh, burrito companies. One called Otero, I think, that
Okay.
failed, and one was Chipotle. And Otero, all they talked about was their ethics. And her point was nobody wants to eat ethics. They want to eat a good burrito, and hey, if it's produced in an
I
ethical
love
way,
that.
awesome, right?
I love
So,
that.
and Chipotle talked about all the great food tastes and like, fresh. And by the way, it's produced in a sustainable way. So,
Exactly.
right. So that's the key unlock, I think, around sort of consumer directed communication that sometimes companies don't get right when they put out these
Yeah.
products, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then on the B2B side, one of the things that I've seen there in working with B2B businesses is that they often don't train their salespeople in the sustainability attributes of the product or service. So the
Mm.
sustainability person feels uncomfortable because they don't want to get caught. Well, oh, what do you mean it's low carbon, or what do you
Yeah,
mean
yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
drives energy efficiency, and so they just don't talk about it. And I've
Right.
seen that happen quite often where they either lose the opportunity for sales, or we've seen when it does work well, they actually get more customer stickiness. Like people get interested in it. It becomes kind of, you don't have to just call them and like, constantly be talking about transactional stuff. You can actually have some more
Yeah.
interesting things to talk to them about.
Yeah.
You don't have to necessarily take them on golf trips. So anyway,
Yeah.
it's right.
Or
So
like
there's
talk about it while you're golfing, like whatever.
exactly, we were talking about golf. Yeah. So on a sustainable green golf. Um, so anyway, it's yeah. So I think there's real mistakes, big mistakes that companies make, and then they're like, okay,
Yeah,
done. Alongside of not tracking the financial returns, so of the intangible as well
exactly.
as the tangibles, because they just track one piece of it, then it may look like it's not making
Exactly.
money. But if they looked at the avoided cost, if they looked at the employee benefits, or I'll talk to you a bit about circularity because that's a really interesting one if you want. But anyway,
Yeah, yeah, I'll come to that. But
okay,
it's like, yeah, it's the bad business or like bad design, bad structural packaging, bad
yep,
marketing, bad storytelling. Like that is conflated into one big thing, and then it's also like, oh, who's the new person in the room? Sustainability. We'll blame sustainability.
right,
It didn't work, right? So like we just blame
exactly.
because like what, like 95% of innovation already like or like things launch fail anyways.
Exactly. So there's a different standard on sustainability
Yeah,
because, of course, some of them are going to fail because something fails, right? It's the same with
exactly.
like another point that I've talked to folks about. They're like, we don't believe these sort of projections around sustainability because you're projecting. I'm like, well, what do you do with your marketing plans? You're projecting,
Yeah, yeah,
like why
yeah.
is sustainability different? I mean, anyway,
Exactly. And
so,
like going back to the tracking, like learn from the failures,
exactly.
right? Like, why did it fail? Like, actually do a deep dive because I remember this, like, oh, like customers hate like these new, the reduced plastic like water bottles because it's so
Hmm.
flimsy and when you
Hmm.
twist the caps, it spills a little bit and it crumbles in your hand. And then I remember we were running these like qualitative interviews like in multiple markets. And like maybe 80% of people had no idea one of the things that was happening when that reduction happened was actually less plastic. And so suddenly they were like, Well, then maybe that's not that of an inconvenience if it's reducing. You know, it's like for people, like, yes, some, like, I'm not saying like there's still like bad design and there's an opportunity to do better design or better pricing strategy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's also the fact that like some might look like behavioral shifts or mindset shifts or even like does everything have to be that convenient, right? Like I mean,
Right.
I'm not talking about accessibility, but like things, some habits that we just got used
Mm-hmm.
to, they might look different, but then also like going back to training and like educating, that also applies to like a consumer base and like why we're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like it's a full journey. You can
Mm-hmm.
make mistakes in any part of that journey. Don't
Yep.
just oh, this is a sustainable innovation that failed. Um, in this like tracking, and maybe this is a more, I mean, probably we're seeing the outcomes of it already in the present, and it's probably a future problem too. Like, I think when I hear tracking, obviously I'm hearing data, and when I'm here, we're not tracking, it means lack of data. And what does that mean in a world where we're like, there's so much hype about everything being forecasted predictive with AI, right? Like, and good data in, good outcomes
Mm-hmm.
out, right? Like, but if we don't have data in this
Mm-hmm.
space, like, as things get automated, and likely we're even like, I mean, I don't want to get into whole like what I think about AI agents and like having more like business decision, critical decisions together with AI. What is that like? Is the problem going to get even bigger if we're not even being like good data,
Yeah.
custodians or like even like enablers in this space?
Yeah, it could very well. I mean, often my students say, well, blockchain is going to solve sustainable supply chain problems. I'm like, no, because
Mm,
the real issue, blockchain can help, but the real
no.
issue is, has that forest been logged at the expense of local indigenous people or massive biodiversity destruction or
Yeah,
whatever? What if what you put into it doesn't really matter that blockchain is going to make it traceable if what it is in the first place isn't any
exactly.
good, you know? So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, so that is I do think there is issues around. I mean, that's not AI per se, but I think there is an issue around like these reliance on these tools. So another example is related to data is that our never mind the financial data, but the related to sustainability, but the ESG reporting data is really
Yeah.
problematic. It's really
Oh.
problematic because the metrics that are used are process and output based metrics versus performance and outcome based metrics. What do I mean by that? Process and output means uh, do you have a policy on X? Just
Hmm.
because you have a policy on X, like DEI or chemical
Yes.
management, doesn't mean you're actually moving the needle on it. I have
Yeah.
no idea what that means. Or
Yeah.
how many people have you trained in, um, you know, uh, health and safety issues? Well, unless I know what the health and safety incident rate is, I don't know if that training has actually made any difference in the health and safety rate. So, but yet, like if you look at um, International Sustainable Standards Board and SASB
Mm.
metrics, those are all, we looked at, I think it's 85% output or activities, not outcomes, right?
Mm.
Also, when you go to kind of understanding the financial impact, think about this. Like if you have a chemical, an apparel company who has aligned with the SASB metrics on apparel, and it says, yes, I
Mm.
understand. I have looked at because they're even don't even ask for an outcome. I mean, output. They just sort of is there. Have you looked at your chemicals? And they're
Yeah.
like, yes, I've looked at them. I understand what they are. Okay, cool. This other company has developed a bio-based dye that reduces toxicity for the workers, reduces problematic water emissions, reduces the amount of energy used and the amount of water used. So lots of operational efficiencies, a lot of reduced
Yeah.
risk, and it is creating competitive advantage because the buyers want to buy that product. Those
Yeah.
two things would be treated exactly the same in the
Mm.
ESG reporting metrics, because the only place that that company who's
Wow.
done that really cool work could do to show what it's doing is to sign, yes, I've looked at my chemical management, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
the data is hugely problematic, right? Even if you've got the data aligned with global standards. In addition, you have a
Right.
lot of data that's not aligned to global standards, so and not audited, right? So it can be faked, it can be just poorly thought through.
Yeah.
Um, and it can be very apples and oranges, right? Some
Yeah, yeah,
companies'
yeah.
data may have scope 1 and 2 emissions, and another might have scope 1, 2, and 3. And like, how do you compare? And the scope 3 might be really problematic, and all that kind of stuff. So for me, even just the ESG data is severely problematic at all levels. And then because companies don't understand how to track the what we call the return on sustainability investment metrics, or ROSI metrics, right?
Yeah.
Um, they don't have that integrated data. So so if you try to manage that with AI without setting up, and this is how I talk to companies about like how to think about all this reporting, but also really how do you drive better performance from a
Yeah.
societal perspective and from a financial perspective, is you start with understanding what the material, environmental, social, governance issues are for your industry and your company.
Mm.
Then you determine what the kind of risks and opportunities are for your business strategy associated with those
Right.
issues. Then you figure out what you're going to, focus on, how you're going to prioritize it, and then you design key performance indicators, not ESG reporting metrics, key performance indicators
Yeah.
related to your plan to tackle those things in the way you do with every other part of your business.
Yeah.
And you associate with those some return on sustainability investment metrics that you put in
Mm.
place from the beginning to track. Then you review quarterly to see how you're doing. You make performance adjustments, and then you map to
Mm.
your ESG reporting metrics at the end, because you have to do that for compliance, right? If you do that, then you're going to be able to really understand like where you need to improve, where you like
Yeah,
learn from, like, oh, this product didn't work, but this one did. Why? Like that kind of stuff, because it's through a performance lens rather than, and this is what a lot of
exactly.
companies do, the tail wagging the dog. Like you don't, like in financial reporting, you do not start with, this is my EBITDA number. You design all these things to get to the EBITDA number. And in ESG reporting, they're like, okay, let me just start with my GHG emissions, right? So that's the, like, do you see what I'm saying?
I
It's
love
like,
that. I think I'm just going to use that example all the time. I think it's relatable to any business person.
yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. And it's such like, and this is like quite chronic in any other space, right? Like there are a lot of policies, principles, guidelines, frameworks out there, but like there is a need for a synthesis of that. Like, what does
Hmm.
that mean for you?
Hmm.
And therefore, what your priorities look like, actions that you need to take look like. And that's like KPIs. I think it's a great way to also like integrate into the business. And then, like, to our earlier point in like the bad data, like there very much be, especially if you're really like not even like moving towards like high speeding bullet training towards a data driven society, unfortunately, like we're out of control at the moment too. Like there is a huge like data literacy component to it too. Like you are in charge of your own data. What is like, how should you collect that data? How should you report data so it's useful data for also
Hmm.
others, right? Like you can't report, I can throw a bunch of data on like one sheet, and to your point, like what does that mean? What does that
Hmm.
even mean, right?
Hmm.
So like with context, build information, right? Synthesize that data. And I don't know how much like do you find, oh, wait, underlying reasons. I mean, some of it is like organizational structure, right? I'm
Hmm.
sure like, oh, that person was working on this, that person didn't even know. There is not only like cultural shift required, but also to your point, like accounting systems, right?
Hmm.
Like some of it is like there are a lot of new initiatives happening, but then we're like putting the bullet train on like historic train
Hmm.
tracks, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, that is not set out for like 2025, 2030,
Hmm.
2050 goals. Um, but then just like, synthesizing this like big picture, how does it impact the system? How does the system need to evolve? And also like going back to the basics in terms of like how do you collect data? How do you report data? And like going back to the training of that, like too, when we also talk about like training on what is the value of
Hmm.
having more sustainable
Hmm.
initiatives. Um, so it's like there are kind of these like side problems related to this like problem, right? That I'm
Hmm.
like also hearing from you. And I think we already started to like you basically gave a roadmap of like how do we address this,
Hmm.
right? Like, and that to me is like going into kind of our like solution mindset a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, and that's like on a consult, I see that as like a consultant lens. Do you
Mhm.
have any thoughts on like better practices or solutions through the other hats you have? Like, what does this mean for educators, right?
Mm.
You kind of captured the consultants, like what does
Mhm.
this mean for consultants? But also like what does this mean anything different for nonprofits, you think? Like it's kind of to speak through
Yeah.
your other hats too.
Yeah. Well, on the education front, I think the parallel where we have our own set of similar problems is that in business schools, I'm going to speak to because that's where I am,
Yeah.
sustainability is not integrated into the core. And this is not just Stern, this is virtually all
Yeah,
business
yeah.
schools, right? They're electives. The core is taught in the same old way. And so I often have classes with somebody said, I just was with a professor who talks about how sustainability doesn't have any place in valuations. And you're telling me not the same. So anyway, we have all that. So I think the lack of integration and understanding of these topics and how they really are core to business management in every field, whether it's finance, accounting, operations, tech, strategy, marketing, it's relevant throughout, right?
Yeah.
But it's not in the core. So that to me is a huge challenge.
Mm.
Um, Also, I think a huge challenge on the research side in academia is that um, faculty on tenure track need to publish in the most prestigious academic journals. The publishing in
Mm.
academic journals takes 3 to 4 years from the time you do the research and it's published.
Yeah.
We're not on that kind of time frame in sustainability. By the time you publish 4 years from now, everybody's moved on to something different, right?
Yeah.
So that time frame is problematic. Also, there's no incentive to do translational research. In other words, to take that
Mm.
research, which can be quite challenging to understand for a layperson, and put it into how is this, or through the mindset of how can this be made useful? I mean, some of it just frankly isn't
Mm.
useful, but some of it
Yeah.
could be made very useful to business. And so at my center, we are actually 100% focused on translational research. And I believe very strongly that you need the other more deep academic research, but it's one of the reasons why you don't get there. And then the other thing, this is beginning to change, but the most prestigious journals until recently did not accept articles on sustainability because they didn't see them as
Oh my
important.
God.
Yeah, so then like I talked to someone a couple years ago who was aiming to get he's an accounting guy. All of his research that he's passionate about is related to sustainability. But for him to be able to get tenure and publish, he had to go do traditional accounting papers instead of like he's really writing like cutting edge sustainability accounting
Wow.
papers, right? But that didn't count. So,
Wow.
there's some very like just like in business, some very bizarre
Mm.
kind of hangovers that we all have to deal
Yeah, you
with.
see where it's starting from. Like, oh, where are we getting these bad habits, I wonder. Let's
Yeah,
go back to
exactly.
school.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
wow.
NGOs, I mean, the problem with that is that, there's so many different kinds of NGOs, so it's very hard to
Right.
kind of speak for all of them. I mean, you have,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
very different strategies that they all have. I think I can speak more broadly, less about kind of this sort of integrating sustainability means, but in terms of my own running and building a number of nonprofits and seeing what works and what fails. I think that uh, people get into nonprofit work because they're passionate about the cause, the mission, which I
Mm.
am.
Mm-hmm.
And I completely support that. But they forget that passion only works if you have a plan to institutionalize the thing you're passionate about. So you need to actually build out the organization, figure out how to get the resources, figure out how to manage people well, figure out how to have early wins so you can get more support, figure out how you deal with the conundrum that NGOs have, which is that if you do one project well, maybe you can go get funding to get another one. But by the time you're ready to do it some
Mm.
more, then the funders have gotten bored. And So like one of the things I did with Rainforest Alliance, which wasn't my idea, somebody else started before me, but I built on it, was to use markets because of with market
Mm,
drivers, we could actually get to scale with these companies versus trying to do a project here and a project there.
right,
But
right,
so
right.
there's just so many constraints on NGOs in terms of how they do things, and there isn't enough investment in, I mean, systems, information management systems, in communications, in people management, in accounting systems, because
True.
nobody wants, and this is not necessarily the organization's fault. It's because the donors want to fund the sexy stuff of like, helping starving children, as opposed to the systems that will actually enable the people to be
Exactly.
more efficient to
Exactly.
help those starving children, right?
Yeah,
So there's a
maybe even
bunch of
collect
inherent.
better data, right? Like,
Exactly. Yeah. So
yeah.
there's a whole bunch of challenges around nonprofit management, some of which come from the people themselves, and some come from kind of the people who fund the organizations.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's really interesting, like because everything is like very intertwined, right? This is all
Exactly.
part of the ecosystem. And when you were talking about like the ed education piece of it, I was like thinking, in design school, like we talk about like the desirability, feasibility, viability framework, right? DVF. And I'm seeing like new iterations of it. Like the fourth circle is responsibility. The fourth circle, if it wants to capture like ethical, and that
Hmm.
includes environment. Or sometimes I see in the companies they use the fourth circle, fourth being sustainability. But you already see how that being a fourth circle that comes after viability, it's an afterthought, right? Like
Right.
how does that get brought back into desirability from the beginning? Like we
Right.
desire this as a business. This is what our consumers want. This is what the world needs, right?
And
Like
also,
kind
it's
of,
integrated in, for example, into viability. I mean, like if you're just
yeah,
looking at fashion, fashion isn't viable in the way that it's continuing to go, you
exactly.
know? So,
Exactly.
like, yeah,
Business
so it's really
viability in
integrated into
general.
all of those. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Feasibility too. Like, are
Yeah.
we like producing this in a very wasteful way,
Yeah.
right? Like, um, yeah, and I think that like I even see this in like, oh, like this is already in a class slide that
Hmm.
this is a model that students should follow. So I think that these diagrams or tools, like educational tools that we used to use, like we use, but maybe was originated, I don't know what year, right? They need a upgrade and update by also professors and to make it
Yeah.
accommodating for actually how business needs to be today. Um, yeah, but I guess like, and this, I think then you can touch upon all these angles, and you're a very qualified person to do so, like on NGO side, educator side, and consultancy business side, in like advice, right? Like in like people who are equally as frustrated maybe as myself, who want to push for progress, right? Considering these buckets, like for a young professional in one of these spaces, or like a student
Hmm.
in education, what would be your advice to them in kind of like, you know, really helping them move towards becoming someone who could push for progress in their space?
Hmm. Well, I think one skill that's important across nonprofits and business today is being able to manage multiple stakeholders to get to a win-win solution.
Mm,
Because there's so many interests focusing on, and because of social media and all the transparency we have, it's much easier to see inside a business or a nonprofit, et cetera, than there used to be. But
yeah.
also the problems are so huge that no one organization can tackle much of them by themselves, and so they need partners. So you have opportunities to build partnerships, to solve for
Mm,
or create new business opportunities or nonprofit opportunities. You also will have people pressuring you and pushing you in various different directions, often competing directions. And then you have to figure out how to navigate that and get people to sort of agree upon a approach that makes sense for your organization,
yeah.
but manages those expectations. So to me, that's a really important soft skill, but that one is really
Mm,
really critical. I would say another one is really um, thinking about things in a systems way. So that doesn't mean that you need to go in and like make your head explode with all the little systems diagrams that go in and out, and like,
Yeah.
but thinking when you understand that everything is part of a system, whether it's a supply chain, whether it's a design approach,
Hmm.
um, whether it's a nonprofit and how it orients to the other entities around it, um, understanding that system and recognizing that you can therefore think out of the box if you understand the broader
Yeah.
system. So just as an example, like I talk to my students about, what do we think of when we think of the word food? And
Mm.
so if you think of food in a traditional way, you're thinking of different kinds of food you like. You might be thinking about a restaurant, you might be thinking about your plate, the
Yeah.
refrigerator. And actually, there was a study done by Kellogg Foundation about Americans, this was some years ago, but Americans kind of thinking about the food system. And for them, the food system was from the retailer to their plate to their garbage, right? Basically. Or no, sorry, from the retailer to the refrigerator to the plate. That's what it was. Retailer, refrigerator, plate.
Mm.
In fact, the system around getting that food to the retailer, then having the food both pass through yourself and what happens to it, but also all the waste all along the way, but at the end, right? There's so
Yeah.
many different elements of the
Massive
system
system.
that if you're thinking about that, then you can innovate. Like you can innovate new products and ideas related to that system.
Mm.
There's a company that's come up with, like, refrigeration is a huge issue for produce, right? And it's like very expensive, very carbon intensive. They've come up with a little product that's bio based and will keep the fruit fresh without refrigeration for X period of time. You only come
Mm.
up with that kind of innovation if you're thinking about the system and where the
Right.
breakdowns are in the system. So that's another thing that I
Right.
think is really
Yeah, I love that.
really important. Um Systems, stakeholders, um being able to think through materiality of environmental and social issues for an NGO or for a business or an investor, right? So,
Mm.
what do I mean by materiality? Um, how important is a given issue to your ability to both to where you have an impact in terms of your impact on it, but also where you have an ability to have an impact on it? So and I see, you see this and you might call this greenwashing. You see a company who doesn't have a lot of impact on water, but it knows that people cares about water. So it's doing some water conservation plan where it's giving philanthropic dollars to water, which is of course not a bad thing, but it has nothing to do with their business.
Yeah.
Um, so like really understanding the materiality of issues, where you should focus and being focused so you can deliver.
Mm.
And there's, I mean, we all know this good management literature is like if you try to manage 10 things, you may manage none of them well. If you try to
Yeah.
manage three, then you're probably going to do each of those a lot better, which doesn't mean
Mm.
that you always manage the same three or that you don't expand once like it's not like you're stuck. But I think that focus, and particularly in the nonprofit world, because we're out there to save the world, it's like very hard to say no. But if you don't say
Yeah, yeah.
no, you end up like doing far too much for too little resources and not having enough of an impact on any of them, right? And business can get that way too. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, no,
those are
it's
just a
like
few thoughts.
setting boundaries as a person too. It's just like, you
Totally.
can't pour from an empty bucket situation.
I'm not
Um,
very good at that myself, I have to say.
well, I mean, but we really appreciate you for everything that you're doing too. But in the end, you have to make it
Right. Got to take care of
sustainable for
yourself.
yourself,
Yep.
to make it happen. But I think this is all really good advice for any student today to also want to get into any of these spaces,
Mhm.
and just start thinking of these early on. And I heard a reframe of soft skills in a conference as power skills, and I
Mm.
100% agree with this. Like, especially in an age of like AI, I think what we call the soft skills are even becoming more and more important.
Yeah.
Um, I love that. And Tansi, I can talk to you all day. I probably have like 50 more questions, but I'm going to be mindful of our time. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Pinar. It was really wonderful. I appreciate the time and all your great questions, and hope that your listeners enjoyed the talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. Make sure to visit our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz, and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our handles in the description below. And don't forget to join us next week. See you.